Hi friends, so I'm here today overlooking the plain of Lake Geneva, which is this glacial valley between the French Jura Mountains in front of me and the Swiss Alps that are behind. Waxing and retreating glaciers that feed the lake and the Rhone River carved this valley and left fertile, arable land around it that has nourished human beings here since the Neolithic period. That's why Geneva was founded here at the mouth of this lake and river. And behind me, this mountain that you can see here is the Salève. That's actually France. And while that's worth seeing, what I really wanted you to see are the strata in these rocks. And I hope you can make this out. Because you see, this plain used to be an ancient seabed. And sometime before the last ice age, this part of the seabed was thrust up by seismic activity. And besides being a high enough point to provide an amazing view over Geneva and Mont Blanc behind it, this mountain also reveals the layers of the primordial seabed, in which you can find all sorts of marine fossils dating back to some of the earliest of the 3.5 billion years of this Earth. And of course, I wanted you to see this because it's exactly the kind of evidence that Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin observed in Edinburgh, in Rome, Africa, South America, and London that gave the geological framework in which they developed their theory. Now, to talk about the theory, I'm going to go back inside where it's warm. And this week, Elizabeth Johnson really gets us into the nitty-gritty of the explanatory power of his theory of evolution. But before we think about that, I want to point out a powerful rhetorical tool that Darwin uses. He admits up front that there are holes in his theory. He names particularly the case of organs that seem to be so fine-tuned that transitional forms wouldn't be functional, such as the eye. However, we know now that there are species with rudimentary optic nerves, for example, and vestigial organs such as our tailbone or appendix, which he promptly and rightfully suggests are the results of divergent evolution, which is borne out in comparative anatomy and embryology today. He also admitted that he was ignorant about certain behaviors and instincts such as bees and wasps, which today are being understood in the field of behavioral ecology and population genetics. But there are two things to learn from this tactic. The first is, as a student, this is a wonderfully disarming technique that I encourage you to use on your papers. Go ahead and admit the problems. It shows what you know, that you know what you're talking about. But secondly, this is an interesting theological move by Darwin. See, in a letter to Asa Gray, he admitted that it was quite hard to persuade himself that, quote, a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created such cruel behaviors. Now, Johnson resonates with this move, writing, "It's somewhat of a relief to think of this law of nature as a secondary cause. In other words, rather than attribute these instincts to the direct plan of a loving God." Rather, Darwin finds much more simplicity and probability in seeing these things not as specially endowed or created instincts, but as small consequences of one general law leading to the advancement of all organic beings, namely, multiply, vary, let the strongest live, and the weakest die. And this leads us now to consider the evidence for this one general law. Building on the text from last week, remember that the theory is based on what Darwin calls two basic truths. First, that species are plastic. They change. They're not created immutably, but there is variation. And second, that these variations are selected by natural pressures and processes. Now, Darwin has no need to really make the case for variation and change, as evolution is something that humans have known for millennia. Farmers and shepherds have always bred animals based on their varied traits. There's even a story in Genesis about Jacob selecting certain sheep from among Laban's flock in order to breed them according to their phenotypes. This was a way of breeding pure animals for sacrifice, and Darwin could see this in the way that people raised and bred pigeons in England. However, what he was proposing was that these variations were the result of descent with modification, not immutable design, and that the traits were selected by natural forces, not just human selection, but natural selection. Now to the first point, variation. A man by the name of Linnaeus had already done the colossal task of classifying animals and plants according to species. That is the source of the old adage, God created, Linnaeus classified. But Linnaeus classified plants and animals on the assumption that organisms were created with similar traits. Therefore, we could look at them and group them together according to that pre-existing design. What Darwin introduced was the idea that shared traits were the result of descent from common ancestors. In other words, he switched the direction. He knew that there would be two basic stumbling blocks for people to accept this. The first was our concept of time, and the second was our ability to imagine space. With respect to time, George Lyell had shown in the geological record that the world was not only shaped by punctuated catastrophes like creation or a flood, but rather it was formed over time and still is. This is what we see in geological formations, that seismic and glacial activity and tectonic activity reforms the Earth and disrupts the fossil record in the process. And with this, Darwin also introduced a new perspective of time. Divergent evolution and extinctions can happen if we measure not in moments of creation, but millennia of geological activity that open up new niches into which species adapt. And the similarities among those groups, classified as species today, reflect, quote, the profound affinities between the living and the dead. Now, this makes an interesting parallel to the communion of saints through time. But he also theorized then about space. He demonstrated possibilities of evolution of waterborne species and flying mammals, as well as plants, and their ability to migrate across barriers or to be found at similar altitudes. He also demonstrated the affinities of species that lived in contiguous land masses, and then the great dissimilarities that existed across barriers. This suggests divergent evolution across vast expanses of time and space. And here the explanatory power of creationism, or acts of special creation throughout time, is complicated if the world is only a few thousand years old. But if we expand our understanding of time to geological and universal time, as even St. Peter tells us to do, then there is enough time and space for these divergent traits to be naturally selected. So on that point of selection, we read in this chapter that he leans into Malthus's economic theory that shortages and competition in resources cause selection. And here now is the seed of what becomes known as survival of the fittest. If there is competition, the strongest will survive. And here are the social implications of his theory that we'll critique next week. But this needs to be read alongside of population dynamics and altruism, and in light of current ecological studies about mutuality and species advantage. And Darwin hints at this with the image of the entangled bank and the harmony that exists there, but also in the fact that he theorizes about sexual selection. And while he didn't know about genetics, which would come later with Mendel and his peas, Darwin did know that the different traits were selected somehow and to be passed on to generations. And here is where I want to end this week, with this idea of intergenerational affinity, or communities of descent. Because you see, this theory can be interpreted as a competition of individuals. But the fact is, every individual who lives is going to die. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. But if we live in an ever-changing and evolving world, then the benefits of natural selection are intergenerational. In a sense, it's not commentary on the individual at all, or the value of the individual. It's a commentary on change in the environment, and the fact that life adapts and has a beautiful way of handling adversity and living in the environment in which we have now. But even more than that, Darwin's theory is rooted in the basic idea of communities of descent. And for me, this is deeply relational and theologically intriguing. Not only are divergent species a sign of creation's will to life, but our embryonic and sometimes anatomical similarities reveal that we share the same nature, or that all of nature belongs to the same category, creatures. And Darwin maps these communities of descent as a tree of life. Johnson writes, quote, "Darwin's theory uncovers the inner affinity of all organic beings to one another, rather than their merely external relations. This realization strikes him with awe. It's a truly wonderful fact, the wonder of which we are apt to overlook from familiarity, that all animals and plants throughout all time and space should be related to each other, in group subordinate to group, in the manner in which we everywhere behold." Darwin himself writes, "It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing in the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other, and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us." Now, with this deeply ecological image of species diversity as harmony, as the beauty of creation, Darwin ends his case. But again, it's not a case against creation, as in the origin of life, but a case for understanding the origin of species. And Johnson here ends the chapter by writing that the theory stands as a watershed for human awareness, profoundly altering our understanding of the natural world, and just as profoundly, our own membership in the evolving community of life. So I want to leave you with this question, where we'll begin this week. How does this theory alter your ecological and relational sense to the evolving community of life? Or could we say, the communion of saints?